Hi everyone. In today's video I'm going to be starting a new series on this channel. At the end of every month I will have a video where I sum up what I've read this month, talk about the books that I've read, whether that's fantasy, classics or gothic literature or anything else, and we can have a discussion about those books in the comments. And also it's a nice way for you guys, if there's a particular book that I mention on the list that you would like to hear me talk more about, you can mention that in the comments, and then in the future that might be a book that I pick to talk about in more depth. This video is also going to be a bit more informal than usual, so grab yourself a drink. I've got myself a glass of pastis because my partner's mother gave us loads of weird alcohol and this is all we have in, so enjoy. So the first thing that I read this month was A New Spring by Robert Jordan. This is a prequel to the Wheel of Time series, and it follows the story of Moraine and Lan as they first meet each other, and it mainly focuses on Moraine. It doesn't really focus on Lan too much. It focuses on her as she finishes her training to become an Aes Sedai, and she learns about the prophecy, about the Dragon Reborn, and she begins to hunt for Rand. Now I did have mixed feelings about this book, unfortunately. I was really looking forward to reading it because I've already read The Wheel of Time once. This is now my second read through as I'm going through and reviewing it on the channel, and following some advice from a YouTuber, Daniel Green, I decided to wait with New Spring until book 5 and then read it after that book, and yeah, I just didn't really get much out of it. I didn't actually know much about New Spring aside from it being this prequel that followed Moraine and Lan as they were hunting for Rand. So I didn't know how much of that backstory we were going to get. And so I was expecting Moraine and Lan to be together quite a lot, but actually they're not together very much in the book, and Lan's parts are really just filler to me. They're not really part of the narrative. Moraine's story is very much embedded in the events of the main text, whereas Lan, until he met Moraine in the story, it just didn't feel like he was doing much. And that was a real shame because I think even in the series, Lan is a character that is a little bit underused. So I was looking forward to something there, and then that didn't happen. Also, the book doesn't finish with Moraine and Lan going to Eamon's Field. It's still very much in the early stages of their search. I believe that Jordan did intend to write the rest of the prequel, but he just never got around to it, which is a real shame because it would have been nice to have a complete prequel story. Very much felt like the first chapter, and it didn't feel very complete. So it was a bit of a letdown for me. One thing though that I did like about it, that I thought was great, was the relationship with Moraine and Swan, which got a lot of development because in the book series, you only see them together for a couple of scenes, and so their friendship is something that even though you see it as a reader, you don't get that much into it. Whereas in this book, it's really expanded on, and also it seems that they're more than just friends as well, or at least that they were once. And to me, this was just fantastic. It was definitely the selling point of the book, and if you're interested in learning more about that relationship, then I would say that this book is definitely worth a read because it's really well done, and it adds just more depth to the relationship between those two women. Okay, so next on the list we have another fantasy, a much older fantasy now, and this is Titus Groan, which is the first book in the Gormenghast trilogy by Mervyn Peake. So this book is probably going to be my top read of the year, and I'll be very surprised if something can knock it off, because it combines all of my favourite things together. We've got gothic atmosphere, we've got fantasy, we've got Dickensian classic kind of characters. All of that stuff is just melded together into this book, and it is just amazing and a great read. I actually listened to this book on audiobook, taking a long car trip with my partner, and we both really enjoyed this book. We were laughing out loud at parts of it. It was just really immersive and just wonderful to read or listen to. So the Gormenghast trilogy, for those of you who don't know, is a series of books which follows the story of Titus Groan, who is the heir to Gormenghast, which is a earldom that is completely separated from everything else in the world. There's a huge mountain called Gormenghast Mountain that's shaped like a claw, stopping you from getting out on one side. There's a swamp on the other side, and there's also huge marshlands which basically you can't traverse because you drown on the other side. So you're pretty much hemmed in into this place, and in the center of it you have Gormenghast Castle, which is this huge labyrinth-like structure, and some of the characters get lost in there. In fact, there's one character who comes in about halfway through the book, and he's been living somewhere in this castle for so long on his own, and no one knew where he was. They knew he was around somewhere, but they couldn't actually find him, and he gets found halfway through the novel for reasons that I won't reveal. But yeah, so huge castle, huge Gothic castle, basically this, like the final form of Gothic castles. You've got this cast of characters, Titus's family, the Groans, who are all eccentric in their very different ways. We have the current Earl of Gormenghast, which is Titus's father, who is just this really depressed person who is just miserable because he's just got to follow all these rules and the laws of the land. You have his wife, the Countess, who is this huge woman who doesn't care about her children very much, but instead she has this like army of white cats that follow her around, and she's very protective of those cats. Then we have Dr. Prunesqualler, who's a mad scientist type who is really excitable and giddy and always has this little laugh, which the audiobook did really well. And you have one of my favourite characters, Fuchsia, who is the daughter of the Countess and the Earl, and she starts off as this selfish, spoiled character who doesn't really like anyone, but slowly through the novel progresses into someone with a lot of emotional depth to her and actually becomes one of the most, I think, well fleshed out characters. Another thing that I really liked about this is that even though it's a Gothic, or it's got Gothic themes, and even though it's a fantasy book or it's got fantasy themes, neither of these things appear in any kind of traditional way. Usually in a Gothic novel, there'll be some kind of supernatural thing going on. A ghost or a vampire or some kind of, creepy dark person or monster. And there's none of that in this. There is some murder and some really scary tense scenes, but there's no explicit Gothic supernatural stuff. Likewise, there's no explicit fantasy stuff. At least in this book, there's no magic, there's no magic system, all that kind of stuff that you expect from a fantasy book. And yet somehow this book manages to be one of, at least for me, one of my favourites in both genres. It just captures that Gothic atmosphere really well, and it captures the magical atmosphere of fantasy books without actually doing any of the standard tropes. So if you haven't read this book, and you haven't read much classic fantasy in general, I really recommend this, because I think it's just a really wonderful, wonderful book. And I'm looking forward to carrying on with this trilogy, and definitely once I've read the whole thing, I'm going to be doing some analysis videos and some guides to Gormenghast, because I think it's just perfect. Okay, moving now away from the fantasy side of things and moving into some sci-fi that I read. We've got two H.G. Wells novels, which I listened to back to back also on a car trip, The Time Machine, and I re-listened to The Island of Dr Moreau. So The Time Machine is a novel that I think most people will have heard of, about a doctor who creates a time machine, goes in the future, sees some things, tells a story about it. The Island of Dr Moreau is something you may not have heard of, but it is about a character who gets washed up on this island, finds himself on this island. I don't think he gets washed up, but he ends up on an island with Dr Moreau, who is a scientist who's lived on this island for years, and he's making animals and turning them into humans, or as closest to humans as he can get them, and they're called beast folk. Now, of these two books, The Island of Dr Moreau was definitely my favourite. I think in both cases the ideas were really interesting, but with The Time Machine, I just wasn't all that drawn in by the characters. The narrator of the story is basically just a tabula rasa. They're just there to narrate the story. The doctor who creates the time machine is just a very generic, excitable scientist, and the characters that he meets when he goes in future in time, he meets these two different types of people, and there just wasn't all that much substance to them. It was very much like, here's my vision of what the future would be like, I'm going to describe it to you. But there was no real intimacy in terms of individual characters standing out, at least not from my perspective. On the other hand, with Dr. Moreau, you had interesting ideas with these beast folk, but also you had some interesting characters to back it up. I really liked the narrator this time around because he was involved in the story. He was the one that went to the island. He was the one that wrote these diaries telling everyone about his experiences there. Also, the Doctor himself is just kind of following in the line of Frankenstein, one of those great mad scientist characters with a great speech about morality and science, when he's justifying his actions to the narrator when he confronts him about it. And also the beast folk are just really interesting, and I like that Wells takes the time to think about how different beasts would react differently to that transformation into a part human creature. So depending on the beast, that might determine how rational they are, how human-like they are, how able they are to be safe to be around, all that kind of stuff. So it just seemed like that book to me was more well thought out. the characters are more interesting, and also I think the idea was more cool. Also, it does appeal a bit to my gothic novel-y type stuff, because it's set on an island, it's isolated, it's kind of scary at times, these beast creatures wandering around, especially towards the end of the book. So yeah, I did prefer that one overall, and would say that that was a lot better than Time Machine, which I liked, but I probably wouldn't read again. So now moving on to away from fantasy and sci-fi altogether, and onto some classics. So in addition to reading a couple of H.G. Wells novels, I also carried on reading more Bronte this month, and managed to get 2 in. I read Villettte by Charlotte Bronte, and I read Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte. And like with H.G. Wells, I enjoyed one of them, and the other one was mediocre. Well, let's start with the book that I actually enjoyed, which is Villettte. Now, this book I actually started reading a couple of months back, and I got about a third into it, and then I think I went for a trip home, didn't read it while I was there, and then just had no motivation to carry on with it, because it's very dense. There are passages in French, the narrator is very introspective, and there's not much plot, so I just kind of got bored of it. But then I thought I'd come back to it, because I really wanted to finish it, because I want to do a guide to the Brontes at some point on this channel, so I do need to read it at some point. But actually this time, for whatever reason, it stuck with me and I enjoyed it. So Villettte tells the story of Lucy Snow, who is a young, shy woman who, after losing her family, for reasons that we don't really know, they seem to have all died in some accident, she then leaves England, goes to Villettte, which is a fictional town in France, and she takes up a job as a teacher for this woman there, and basically it chronicles her story there, and that's everything from the most mundane things to some more profound things like her unrequited love for this guy, as well as her depression as a character who is feeling very isolated and alone in this world where most people just seem to not notice her, or even the people that like her, they seem to be very much like, oh Lucy, you're so nice, but you know, there's nothing else there. Everyone kind of overlooks her as just this nice little thing that they can pet on a corner and ignore, but then call on when they're upset, because people are selfish like that. So yeah, it's a very difficult book, because most of it does stay inside Lucy's head, and she isn't a very active character. Most of the time we're just seeing her listening to other people's conversations or being ignored by people, and if you like a plot-based book where lots is happening, you will find this hard to read, especially because it's quite long. I think my edition is about 500 or so pages. So it really is a taxing read, but actually when you get through it and the ending is just comes out of nowhere in a really great way, it's really worth it. And I think anyone that is a bit introverted or a bit shy, if you're willing to put the time with the book, you might actually find you relate a lot to Lucy Snow as a character, because you know, she's someone who, inside her head, she's very strong and colourful, and she's quite strong-willed. But no one in the world sees her that way, because all of that stuff is inside her, and she doesn't display it because she's not an extroverted person. She's not like, say, Jane Eyre, who is very strong-willed and very frank about how strong-willed she is. She's like the anti-Jane Eyre, if you like. So yeah, it's a difficult read. It's definitely not as accessible as Jane Eyre, or Agnes Grey for that matter. But it is a fantastic book, and I did eventually enjoy it, and I probably will give it another read soon too. Now onto the other Bronte book that I didn't like as much, and that is Agnes Grey. Now this has a similar plot to Villettte, at least in the general sense, because it's also about a young woman who takes up a job as a governess, although this time it's a governess rather than a teacher, but they're very similar things. So I do like Anne Bronte's work, and I have reviewed her other novel, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, on this channel, and I think that's a great book, equally on par with the other Bronte classics. But Agnes Grey for me just fell a little bit flat. Basically, if I was to sum it up, it's girl goes to get a job as a governess, doesn't like it, and moans about it for 300 pages. Now I'm sure in its day Agnes Grey was probably a very good book in terms of what it did for revealing the working conditions for governesses, because they probably did get treated like shit by a lot of people, and they probably did get ignored and all these things. So in that context, yes, I can see why the book was successful in its time. I can see why lots of people were shocked by the book, because, you know, these rich people who hired these governesses, as is clear in the book, they think they're really nice people. I think they're really good people. So to have someone write this story probably would have been shocking at the time. But obviously we don't really have governesses now, and so a lot of the power of the book, I think, is lost and trapped in that time. Whereas you compare this to, you know, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, where it's about, you know, an abusive relationship, that could happen anytime. It happens now, it happens forever, right? There are always going to be those things, and that's why the book has a bit more staying power. Or likewise with Villettte, you've got a story about this introverted woman being ignored and unrequited love and blah blah blah, and again all these things have staying power because they're more universal. Whereas this just feels like a political statement in, you know, the time when Anne Bronte lived. So it just doesn't, it really didn't have much to offer, at least from my perspective, than some of the other Bronte books did. All that being said, I would say it wasn't a terrible book, it was just okay. I'm glad that I read it for completionist's sake. And also, Anne Bronte of the sisters, she's probably one of the more direct writers. The good thing about Anne Bronte is that she just has this direct, no-nonsense style. She gets to the point, and there's no window dressing. And so if you want an in to the Brontes, I'd probably still recommend The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, but you could use Agnes Grey for that purpose. You know, it's clearly written, it's accessible. It's just a shame that, at least me, not really into the story all that much. That's my timer telling me to take a break. Alright, break over. Another drink. Let's carry on. That actually timed pretty well, because now we're done with the books that I finished reading in August, and now we're on to the books that I'm currently working my way through. That I just want to give my brief thoughts on how things are going with these books. So first we have The Vampire Armstrong, which is the 6th book in Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles trilogy, I was going to say then for some reason, series, which I'm carrying on with eventually. Now. God, I think I might have drunk too much. Okay, so The Vampire Armstrong tells the story of Armand, who is a recurring character who's been in some of the other books, and now he's getting to tell his story from when he was a human to him becoming a vampire, and I don't actually know because I haven't finished, but I presume the story will take us up into the present. So far, I'm about 200 pages into this one, and we have just come to the conclusion of Armand's human life. He has just been made into a vampire by Marius, who is another character who's been in previous books as well. Thoughts so far? Probably I would say a bit mixed. So when I started the book, I wasn't getting into it. I thought the opening was with Armand in the house, Lestat's there, who's still asleep from the events of the previous book, and he talks to David Talbot, who is another vampire, and David asks him to tell his story. I don't know, the opening, it felt very much like the original opening to Interview with the Vampire, where you have Louis with Daniel, who's just called the boy in that book. You know, they meet to have this interview, and then the story begins. It felt very much like that, but less atmospheric, less tense. It was just, yeah, just kind of there. And then getting into Armand's narrative voice for me was a little bit hard, because he doesn't have the kind of flamboyance, say, of Lestat, who's very charismatic and fun and all that kind of great stuff. He's very much, Armand's a bit more like Louis, I would say. He's more brooding, he's more whiny maybe. Although I would say he's distinctive from Louis. He's more direct than Louis is. He's not as poetic as Louis is. And I think in a lot of ways he's more androgynous than either Louis or Lestat. His writing style to me seems sometimes very feminine and sometimes very masculine, which I'm enjoying, especially as the novel's going on, that's coming out more. So we will see where we go with this one. I know it seems to be a book that has a lot of mixed feelings about it. Some people really like it, some people hate it, although most people seem to hate it because of the amount of gay sex in it, which, I wonder why, but I don't really mind that, so we'll see where it goes. We'll see if I enjoy it, we'll see what I have to say about it when I have finished it. But so far, it's okay, it's not good, it's not bad, and it seems to be getting more interesting, so hopefully the book will get a lot better as we get into it. The second thing that I'm currently reading is The Fairy Queen by Edmund Spenser, which I've been reading for a long time because it's an epic poem that's 1,000 pages, and it's in the kind of Shakespearean English. So, hard to read, very long, very dense. Luckily for me though, it is actually split into 6 books, and I currently am on book 3. I've just finished book 3, and that's the book that I read this month. So for those of you who don't know, The Fairy Queen is essentially an epic fantasy poem that tells the story of different knights and different virtues. And so far at least, every book has been about a particular knight and a particular virtue. Book 3 is about Britomart, a female knight, and the virtue that we're looking at in this book is chastity, because of course it is. This might actually be my favourite book so far, partly because I am getting more into it as I'm going with it. Obviously when you read more of something you kind of get a bit of a rhythm going, so it's easier to stick with it. But also it's nice because Britomart interacts with knights from previous parts of the book, so you're more grounded in the characters at this point and the things going on. I also enjoy the fact that Britomart is disguised as a knight sometimes, and people, like some of the knights or villains who she comes across, kind of are attracted to her, but they don't know that she's a woman. And I always like that in things like, it happens a lot in Shakespeare, right? This kind of mistaken identity thing. And I always feel like there's a thing to be explored there about androgyny and gender, and how, you know, men and women are sometimes attracted to not necessarily men and women, but like masculinity or femininity. And so when you see someone who's androgynous, who you think is male but is mostly female, and you're straight, you might actually be interested in that person. So it's kind of a cool thing, a cool playing around with gender, especially in this particular book that I'm really enjoying. And we'll see where it goes in the next books, because actually Britomart's story doesn't finish at the end of book 3, ends at a cliffhanger. So we will see how this all goes in future books. I would also recommend The Fairy Queen to anyone who wants to read some kind of classic epic fantasy. I mean, obviously you have obvious ones like the Odyssey you might read, or the Iliad, but no one has really heard, or at least in my social bubbles, no one's really heard of The Fairy Queen, which I think is a shame, because I think it is actually a very interesting and great, you know, piece of work. Yes, I imagine the reason why it's possibly overlooked is because it's a poem, because it's in that kind of Shakespearean English, and it's not a play, so it doesn't get performed, which is a real shame, because it's a really good, interesting story. It's like that classic Arthurian quest stuff. So if you like all that stuff, I think you'd really enjoy this one. And you can get translations of it where they make the medieval English, not medieval, the Renaissance English, they make that more like modern English. So if you want to give it a go and you're a bit worried about, oh, all that stuffy language, get one of those translations and let me know what you think of it, because I think it's a really interesting book and there's lots of things to explore there. Okay, so these are all the books that I read or am reading currently this month. Hopefully there were some books there that you thought were interesting. Please let me know in the comments if you've read any of these books, what do you think about them. If you'd like me to do more in-depth reviews, analyses of these books or writers, let me know, because that will be useful for planning future videos. And also let me know, what did you read this month? What books did you read? Whether that's fantasy, classics, gothic, literature, non-fiction, whatever. Just let me know in the comments, and I always like talking with you guys, so please let me know in the comments below. But yeah, I do need to stop because I'm feeling a little bit tipsy at this point. So take care everyone, and I will see you all in the next video.